Today we're going back in time to Salem, Massachusetts for the Salem Witch Trials. We're going to uncover the mysteries of Salem. Today we have a special guest, historian and author Alice Markham-Cantor. Alice has written a powerful new book, The Once and Future Witch Hunt, A Descendant's Reckoning from Salem to the Present. In it, she explores her personal connection to the Salem Witch Trials and examines how the legacy of fear and injustice from that era continues to influence our society today. So join us as we delve into the haunting stories of Salem and learn what lessons we can take from history to shape a better future. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told Studios for the first time, author, historian, Alice Markham-Cantor. Hello, hello. So I hope I said your full name correctly. If I didn't, please correct me on it. So
very well. Yeah, you said it perfectly.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited to have you here because, just in a month or so, the Halloween season comes and we start getting into the witches and the ghosts and all that stuff. But as people can see on the screen, if you're not watching, it's called The Once and Future Witch Hunt, A Descendant's Reckoning from Salem to the Present. So, well, I'm always excited about Salem because I did have an ancestor. He had an N, and I'm trying to think of his name. I'll have to think about it, but it had something to do with not Salem, but with another city that was known for the witch trials. So I'll have to think of it and share it with you.
Yeah, let me know when you remember.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I got somebody else that was part of that genre of history that we all, look into as, like I said, the Halloween season gets started. Well, Alice, you wrote this book, and I'm really inspired by it because you've kind of added kind of a fiction, nonfiction together. And I'm curious, can you explain how you approach the research process for both aspects of your writing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I didn't actually set out to write a hybrid.
Oh, really?
I know that was going to happen. And at different points, I would stop in the process and be like, does this work? Or is this just gonna be too weird for people to sort of move back and forth between them. But I started with the nonfiction research, obviously. So I started with, as I talk about in the book, it grew out of research that I started in college, where I was working on a senior thesis about Salem. And I sort of started delving into the archives. The amazing thing about Salem is that there's a lot of primary source material. Yeah. And there's a whole thing, and we can go into this. There's not as much primary source material as there should be because some of it has been lost.
Right, I'm sure.
Years, but there's still a lot. And it has, at this point, almost entirely been digitized, which is amazing. In terms of the court records that exist, the preliminary hearing transcripts, the indictments and confessions and all of this. So I started there. I started with the primary source stuff. And I started with reading historians about Salem, historians, sociologists, some people going into the sort of economists, some anthropology adjacent people. So sort of a big range, but I came at it from a very, at first from a very academic point of view. I did read a couple historical fiction novels set at the time, but I try to be careful there because I didn't want to sort of give myself an unconscious idea of any of these people that wasn't coming from the primary source material. So, there's a historical fiction novel about Martha Carrier out there, my ancestor.
Now, did you go into this knowing that she was your ancestor or no?
I did go into
it. Okay.
Yeah. So I found out that Martha Carrier was my ancestor when I was 13 years old. Okay. And then in college, I started doing this research, and then the book grew out of that. I purposefully didn't read any historical fiction novels about Martha. or too many, really about Salem sort of as a whole.
Right.
Want to get get that sort of confused. But yeah, it was really spending a lot of times with the trial transcripts, the ones that exist. That's where I started. And then just, the history of Puritan Massachusetts as a whole.
Now, for the people that really don't know a lot, I mean, I can't believe you wouldn't know about Salem witch trials. But these days you never know, especially the younger generation. They don't seem to care about history. So, but could you do, like, for the people that are tuning in, kind of just a quick overview of what the book and then really what the Salem witch trials were about,
Totally.
and then we'll dive right into the book deeper.
Sounds good. Yeah. Salem's a funny thing because almost everybody's heard of Salem,
right?
And most people don't. The knowledge is often very surface level. Just like we're not really taught about it. We don't we're not taught in schools to engage with it in any sort of deep way. So it's this story that everybody knows and people tend to have a lot of misinformation about. So the Salem witch trials took place in 1692. They really last. The first accusations happen in March of 1692, the first formal accusations. The first official trials are end of May, beginning of June. And then everything's done by the end of that year.
Right.
It's like a 6-month period where people are actually actively being tried. So it's very short. And people, sometimes have an idea that this was a multi-year thing. And it would more accurately be called the Essex County witch hunts. They are not just in Salem. Right. They start the accusations begin in a place called Salem Village, which is not modern day Salem. It is today known as the town of Danvers, right next to current day Salem, which was in 1692 known as Salem Town. So they were linked, but the accusations actually begin in Danvers, which is the heart of the trials. And they spill over into other towns in Massachusetts and eventually reaching as far away as Maine. Someone is accused in Maine and brought down to stand trial. And over 150 people are accused of witchcraft, formally accused. Over 50 people confess to witchcraft. And then 19 other people, notably none of those who make confessions, that's important, are hanged for witchcraft, are executed. And 5 more people die in prison, and 1 is tortured to death. So the total death toll is 25, and it lasts about 6 months, and then it sort of comes to a screeching halt. And for the last 300 years, we have been left to try and figure out what happened.
Now, the people that did confess, were they willingly confessing, or were they I was going to say we had to clarify.
Yeah, so the confessions were definitely coerced. In terms of only there actually was very little physical torture in the Salem witch trials, which was unusual for when you compare it to the European witch trials of the same period. Right. A lot more torture in Europe. Not so much in Salem. There's 1 man who was tortured to death, and then 3 teenage boys were physically tortured. But other than that, we don't. And we know that 1 person, not coincidentally, the first person to confess, was very likely beaten into her confession. And this is Tituba, whose name heard. But we can circle back to her. But so the confessions often come about, first of all, the jail conditions are horrible. It's a really horrible place to be. And over the course of the trials, it's never officially said by the court, but one of the magistrates, John Hathorne, sort of intimates that maybe if people confess, the court will be lenient with them. It's sort of, the idea of like a plea deal for a witch for the first time, which was a total new thing in Puritan legal, in the Puritan legal paradigm. You weren't supposed to be able to plead guilty to witchcraft and survive. But this is what begins to happen in Salem, where it becomes very clear as the 6 months of the Salem witch trials are happening, that people who confess to witchcraft are not the ones being hanged, and the people who are maintaining their innocence are the ones being hanged. And so I think that, while there was not an official court position, it does become, it's hard to imagine that people wouldn't have considered this. And people were badgered and badgered by the court. Like, they were interrogated until they broke, effectively, often. Some of the confessors. And some of those people later said, they recanted and said, I only confessed because I was frightened into it,
Right.
and I didn't mean it, and I shouldn't have said that. I was, terrified. I thought I was going to. And then finally, there is a real thing within the Puritan consciousness where people were able to sort of convince themselves that they were witches. And some historians have written extensively about this, and it's a really interesting sort of religious paradigm that has to do with Puritan religion, where they think not only is it possible for someone to have made them a witch, possibly even without their knowledge or permission, but they could then sort of confess that and use that as a purging experience where they can then, it reconciles them with God if they're able to confess and, renounce the devil. And so some people were like, oh yes, I guess this person made me a witch and I didn't know, or I've just found out. And so it wasn't like anybody was saying, yes, for sure, everyone knows this is great. There was one guy who was like, yes, I've done a lot of, he was a folk healer, and he was like, I've done a lot of this. And in fact, I can kill witches. And that did not go in the direction he'd hoped. The judges were like, that's still bad. But he also was sort of known as having potentially some mental health issues. He was sort of known as like he'd had a lot of run-ins with the court before. So he's not our most reliable source.
Now, many of these people that were accused, was this mostly revenge, or that they accuse these people? Because, we see that even now. It's like, I don't like that person, so that person is bad, or that person is a thief, or that person. We see this a lot even today, where what were the reasons many of these people were accused? Was it something that, like you said, their chicken laid 2 eggs, or was it something that, she looked at my wife wrong, or something?
It's definitely, there's definitely some of both of those things. There is, it's just very evident when you look at who's accusing who, that there are old grudges and these sort of long simmering tensions. So like land disputes with your neighbor, inheritance disputes that end up surging up in the trials and becoming something that people are clearly reacting to. And this gets a little tricky because you have to think of it sort of through the Puritan worldview, right? Which holds that it's in some cases, it may have been blatant revenge. It may have been, that person stole my inheritance and I want to get back at them. But it also, the Puritans really were working in a worldview that said that nothing happens by accident, right? So when they start to realize that there could be witches in the community that are causing harm to the community, and they're looking for people who wish them harm, who are you going to look for? You're looking for someone who's already your enemy. You're going to look for someone who you've already had the land dispute with, who you had the inheritance dispute with. And so there's some cases in which it was probably revenge, and some cases in which it was probably retroactive explanation for why you hated them in the first place. It's like, oh, well, of course they were my enemy. Of course they tried to steal my land. They were a witch all along. And so it becomes this back and forth. I'll give the example of my ancestor, Martha Carrier, who was accused by a lot of people. She becomes... She's one of the first people to be accused in Andover, which is the town that she's from. She didn't live in Salem. And she gets accused by a neighbor of hers who gives the example that when she thought he was trying to plant on her land, she loses her temper and shouts at him that, she's going to stick as close to him as the bark to a tree. And if he plants on her land, he will regret it before 7 years have passed. That's her stance. So it sort of, that kind of threat is not the smartest kind of threat to make, to be like, you're really going to regret this within 7 years. Because then he, if a calf sickens and dies, he thinks, well, she did it. Clearly, she wishes me ill. A similar thing happened with a nephew of hers, where she was like, this wound that you have isn't going to heal. Plus, I'm really mad at you. And then he attributed the fact that the wound did not heal to her witchcraft. So there are definitely these sort of personal slights that then resurface in the trials.
Well, before we go into Tuba, when you were writing the book or doing your research, was there anything that really, because like you said, we know a lot about the witch trials, at least the people that are interested, but was there anything that surprised you or shocked you in your findings of research about the witch hunts or historical or anything like that, or in current day that might have just said, hey, wow, I did not hear this before?
Definitely. I mean, the single biggest thing, this would bring us a little bit into the present, and we can circle back on this as well.
Yeah.
The single biggest thing is how many witch hunts still happen today.
Still?
So around the world today, there are, best count we have right now is that about 1,000 people are the victims of witchcraft accusations and then being harmed, killed, tortured, exiled, or otherwise suffering repercussions as a result of those accusations every year around the world. About 1,000 people. That was way more than I thought there were going to.
You shocked me.
We don't hear about this. These accusations and harms have taken place in over 50 countries in the last decade. They have taken place all over the world, and they continue to be a major issue that communities have to deal with.
So let me ask you this, in modern day terms, what are some of the motives of modern terms, and the punishments are still similar? Or is it just more like she's a witch and don't have anything to do with her, like social outcasting?
There's a real range. There are definitely cases where she's a witch and, we don't want to have anything to do with her. But there's also examples of people being burned alive, being, beaten and sometimes, or tortured in like pretty horrible ways. And the motives, I mean, there's no perfect like one size fits all, but there are patterns. Right. And we see witch hunts happening around the world today in the same in the same sort of patterns that we saw them happening in Puritan Massachusetts and in Europe in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, which are places that are undergoing extreme economic upheaval, places especially that have had, are having sort of a lack of social safety nets, a lack of health infrastructure, and a lack of people feeling that they have no recourse from their government, from sort of finding a way to make life better in that way. There's a model of witch hunts that I find really useful. It's known as the wildfire model. That basically holds that in order for a witch hunt to happen, you need to have the ground be primed for it, the way that you have to have, underbrush build up before a forest fire. And this priming is the kind of thing I'm talking about with like economic upheaval, political upheaval, inequality. Plus, you do need your community to believe that witches are an active threat, or like not just, that they are a threat to the community in some way. Right. And then you need a spark of some kind to sort of set it off. And this, probably the most common spark is health issues. So unexplained illnesses, unexplained deaths, that kind of thing. And then, which is exactly how Salem gets started, by the way, right? Like there's health issue that these two girls in Salem start having, and it's the same thing. But there is today also a very big problem that has to do with land theft and inheritance. So, for example, there was I saw a good article about this recently in Kenya that had to do with older men being accused of witchcraft, so that they could be then killed or removed from the community so that other relatives could inherit the land. And this is this is an ongoing thing. This is a huge problem, land theft, and sort of using it as a method of property seizure.
That's just, it's pretty crazy because you hear that all the time of, families battling over the money or the land or whatever. But to go to that extreme, that's just crazy. But what is your thoughts? Because, I've been doing Truth Be Told Paranormal for many years, almost 1,000 episodes. I've interviewed some of the most amazing psychics, witches, people from all walks of life. And I find everybody fascinating. There's some people I'm like, it's not necessarily I totally believe what they believe, but I'm open to hear their side of the story. But with, witches, even back in the 60s, Bewitched, and there's, Elphaba with Wizard of Oz in 1939, and now just the list goes on and on and on about witches. Where are these happening? Some of these countries, like you said, it sounds like in Africa, but it doesn't sound like, well, maybe it's here in America, but I think with more acceptance of people that have a different beliefs, or is it more of a hidden thought of like, oh, I accept people behind the scenes? It's like, no, this is my religion, Christianity, and they take it to the extreme because we hear it. But so where are these coming from?
Yeah, I'm hearing sort of two questions in there, so I'm gonna
probably is
break it out a little bit. And I think so. The first one, most witch hunts, or the language that often gets used is harms associated with accusations of witchcraft. But I'll use witch hunts because it's a lot shorter. Are most common in the global South today, particularly in countries that were colonized and have been sort of recovering economically from that in the last couple decades. They're a big problem in India. They're a big problem in Papua New Guinea. They're a big problem. They're a rising problem in parts of South America, and they're a big problem in parts of Africa. So all over. They do happen in the United States and in England and in Europe. But they are more often explained as mental health issues rather than as witch hunts. So, for example, there was a man who, in 2013 in New York City, killed two women who he said he believed had bewitched him. He killed them for putting a spell on him, he believed. This was then reported on as like he was having a mental health issue. But in another country, it would be reported as he killed this person for witchcraft. So it depends on, what does the community at large believe? Right. How do we frame the issue? I think then the second thing that I think is really important when we're thinking about witch hunts versus belief in witches is that people who are the victims of witch hunts almost never identify as witches.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, this is the tricky thing because it's pretty rare actually for the people. Sometimes you may get someone who identifies as a traditional healer of some kind to as the victim of a witch hunt, but it's most common that in that case the person doing the accusing is another traditional healer in the community, and it's like sort of inter-employment thing. But it's pretty rare. Mostly the people who are victims of witch hunts are not people who are claiming this. And so fundamentally, like it's not really an issue of like what do these people believe? Do they think they're witches? Do they not think they're witches? Like they almost never think they're witches. They are accused of witchcraft, but they're not claiming it. And so I think that's really important when we think about this and when we think about, because there's a thriving culture in the United States, where of people who feel very differently about this, but it's not. It's just like a different social thing.
Well, this kind of brings us to a question where, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. How do you think feminism and the study of gender dynamics play a role in this? Both the historical side and the contemporary side of witch hunts. I mean, it keeps coming back to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. The gender dynamics of witch hunts are, enormous. You can't look at them without looking at them. So first of all, as like a quick overview, in the Great Witch Hunts of Europe, which are this period of about 300 years from the late 1400s to the late 1700s, with the big hot spot in the middle of that. And our best count is like 50,000 people killed for witchcraft, and probably 80% of them women, although those numbers are pretty iffy because of sourcing. Salem as well, all the people, Salem as well is mostly women. And in fact, the fact that so many men were accused and executed in Salem is part of what clues the authorities into the idea that there might be something wrong here.
They're like, wait a minute, this is only women.
Yeah. And today, very difficult to tell, again, because we have really incomplete data. And it very much varies from place to place. But it is definitely still women are primary targets of witch hunts. And part of this has to do with social power. So women tend to have less social power than men. They're often, especially if these are older women who may not have, maybe widows, may not have families around them, they're easier targets in many ways. And I think that the fact that this is, actually, I'll go to that in a second. The fact that so many women have been the victims of witch hunts, I think, is part of what has created like the witch as the feminist archetype, which we saw a lot in the 60s. We see a lot today with people feeling like to be a witch is to be a feminist. It's to be an outspoken woman, and it definitely to be very clear, diverging from expectations of gender and diverging from expectations of womanhood and femininity and being a woman who didn't act like a woman was supposed to act. All of these things are definitely risk factors for being accused of witchcraft historically. Because you're not fitting into the social fabric in a way that is accepted and controllable. But these are not often the only reason that people are accused. It can get a little bit more, it's a little more complicated. It's not like just like they were killed for being outspoken women, but it definitely is a big risk factor. If you're an outspoken woman and you are poor, that's going to be really bad. That's the big risk factor. There's an excellent book that I will recommend to all your listeners if they're interested in learning more about the gendered connection in the Great Witch Hunts of Europe, which is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I talk about it a lot in my book. And it basically traces how the Great Witch Hunts of Europe were actually used to enforce and in some ways create the new paradigm for women under capitalism, which is growing in this period and really emerging as the dominant economic system. And Federici argues that the witch hunts, that the emergence of capitalism both creates the witch hunts and is reinforced by them. So highly recommend.
Which I think is funny is, because witch itself, even when I was growing up, was very negative tone because, you're such a witch. I mean, you use it to, to use it as a negative tone to it. But like you said, but what I found fascinating when Bewitched came out, it actually came out, and even Wizard of Oz, it came out with a positive negative side. I mean, which I found fascinating that they showed both sides of the spectrum there.
I think there's always been an urge to sort of reclaim, or not always, but in the last century and a half, there's been an urge to reclaim the witch label and to say, this could be a good thing. This is important. And I think that that's a really interesting cultural phenomenon, and has to do with sort of, both our changing society in terms of religiosity and secularism, and also in terms of, the reevaluation of feminism and the links, people trying to link feminism and spirituality and find a new feminist spirituality and all of that. And I think, I'm always really interested in ways that people can be inspired by the witch identity and the witch, sort of the history of the witch hunts. I just think the most important thing that I remind people is just that the people who were killed historically and are killed today did not call themselves witches. And so, if you're drawing an emotional connection to them, based on calling yourself a witch, that is sort of a newer creation. But there are definitely ways to feel emotionally connected to them, especially if you are, doing the kinds of things they were doing and challenging expected patriarchal norms, or, expected economic norms, various things. But it's sort of off track.
No, I find this all fascinating. Well, I want to jump back to a couple people. One of the first women, or just people accused of witchcraft, of course, is Tuba, who Samuel Parris, she was owned by him. From what we know, why was she accused? I know she even admitted to being a witch, and it sounded like she admitted it pretty much like, I'm a witch.
Yeah, so Tituba is she was enslaved. She was owned by the minister of Salem Village,
right?
And she is among the first 3 people to be accused. It's her, the local beggar woman Sarah Good, and a woman named Sarah Osborne, who hadn't been to church in years. And so you see a thread between these 3 women, which is that they are 3 of the most vulnerable people in Salem Village, right? Like, these are 3 people who, if they get accused of witchcraft, nobody is going to defend them.
Right.
And 2 big misconceptions about Tituba. The first one, and this mostly is because of historians in the 1800s reimagined her as Black. Tituba was very probably Native American. She may have been indigenous from Barbados or from South America, but she was Native American of some kind. And the other big important thing about Tituba is that she was actually quite young. There's this imaginary of her as
that's what these pictures make her look evil
these
and
pictures
young.
Show her
or
as
old.
like old woman. She was no more than like 32.
Oh,
at
wow.
the time. She could have been as young as 25. And so she's actually not that much older, than the girls accusing her, which is interesting. But so she's accused, and here's the thing about Tituba's confession, which is that when she confessed, she had on her, it's noted in the source material, marks of the devil's wounding of her. In other words, visible bruising. In other words, she had been beaten before her confession. We don't know who did it, although we do know that a few months later, Tituba told someone who was visiting her in the Salem town jail that it had been Samuel Parris. So, there's no way to corroborate this at this point, but this is what that man then wrote later. He also did have a little bit of a bone to pick, but anyway. So Tituba very likely confessed because she had been beaten into it by Samuel Parris. So her confession is, it's tricky. It's the thing that sort of sets up the trial, sets the ball rolling, because Tituba says that there are other witches in Salem Village, which means then they have to go find them. But she effectively, I've always sort of thought that if she knew at all what she was doing, if she did that, if once she's been beaten and she confesses and then she tells them there's other witches and they have to go searching, she effectively destroys Salem, which, is a pretty powerful thing to do. Not through witchcraft, just through some really smart words.
She was like, if I'm going down, everybody's going down, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's very little power available to her in this moment, right? She's an enslaved woman.
Right.
She's an indigenous woman in the Puritan community. She's a stranger here. She's been accused by the very same girls that she's helping to raise. Like the betrayal there is also really intense. And she, there's no way to know if she did this with any intention at all, right? It could have just
Right.
been she's also being badgered and interrogated in this moment. So she could just be, she's totally just saying things, but the effect is really powerful.
Now, your ninth great-grandmother, Martha Allen Carrier, she was hanged. How old was she? And her children, she had to have children or you wouldn't be here. How did they get removed from, an inheriting witchcraft or being a witch at all? So I'm curious on how the family sometimes got away.
Right. So she was about 40 years old. She's got 5 children and a husband. Her oldest child is 17 when the trials start. Her youngest is 2.
Oh, wow.
And her children don't escape is the short answer.
Oh.
4 of her 5 children are accused and arrested. And her 2 older children, the 17-year-old and 15-year-old boy, are tortured for confession. But what happens is that her children, when they're tortured, confess to witchcraft, and the 2 younger children also confess and name their mother as a witch. And, confessors, as we talked about before, are not the court's priority.
Right.
There's debate about if the court intended to hang them. It seems like some yes, but it's not the priority when the witch trials are at their height. And so by the time the trials end, they haven't had a chance to hang these children and never do. And
were any of those your great grandfathers?
Yeah, the second son, one of the 2 who's tortured, is
wow.
my great etc. grandfather.
Wow. And so, yeah, it's a sad kind of a part of our history, but I mean, but if you look back, there's so many different sad parts of, American history, is how we've tortured many different people for just because, like you said, they believe differently. So what is a message or a call of action, that for your readers that you hope take away from this book?
So, I think that I have sort of 2 main hopes. The first is that I really want people to pay attention to the fact that witch hunts still happen and to why, which is, a lot of the same reasons that Salem happened and that historical witch hunts have happened, which are these, real policies of economic deprivation and economic instability. Like witch hunts are an economic issue. They are a gender issue, they are a political issue, and they are an economic issue.
Right.
Have to do with resources and who is allowed those resources. And do people have recourse when they feel that their livelihoods are slipping away? Or do they need to figure out a scapegoat? So that is a big thing that I hope people take away. And the other is that thinking about the way, the fundamental thing about witch hunts is that they always target the most powerless people first. This is why Tita Tuba is one of the first 3 to be accused. You don't start by accusing the wife of the governor. You start by accusing enslaved woman, right? So I think that this is something that obviously continuously happens today in our more metaphorical witch hunts, where whenever there is an attempt to deprive people of rights or to otherwise, make life worse for people.
Right.
It always targets the most powerless people first. And I hope that, my hope is that in thinking about Salem, because as you said, Salem is one of many, pieces of American history that are less than ideal.
Right.
And it just happens to be one that's incredibly well documented and really interesting to people. And so my hope is that in studying Salem and in reading my book, people will be able to think about how does power work? Who does it target? How can I sort of think about who is it targeting around me? And what can we do to stop things like that before they really get the ball rolling?
Because that actually came to mind, there's so many different organizations to combat, many different things from sex trafficking and all kinds of things. But is there any type of support to combat modern day witch hunts? Because I was curious, I'm like, are there any like organizations to stop something like that?
So there are a bunch. There tend to be more local organizations, but I'm part of an organization called the International Network Against Accusations of Witchcraft and Associated Harmful Practices, which is an incredibly long name to say that we help connect different groups around the world that are working on this. And so if you go to our website, which I can give you the URL,
please,
which is it is www.theinternationalnetwork.org. You can find us there, and we have a contact button, a donation button, and we connect with various other groups around the world who are working on this on the ground.
Perfect.
And do education work or otherwise intervene when witch hunts happen.
Because it's definitely, we need to stop this abuse and killing. Sounds like sometimes the people that are not even, like you said, don't even relate to what they're being accused of. So,
yeah.
Well, I'm a big history buff, and I'm not a writer as of yet. But sounds like you love to write. But what would you advice that you would give like an aspiring writers and researchers who really want to tackle historical subjects like what you did with the witch hunts? Where would they start? Because that's a big part of it. You can't just sit down and start writing. You need to know what to do.
I think fundamentally, you do really have to start with the research, which means just like reading everything that you can get your hands on about it. And I definitely privileging primary sources, but also, respected historians. And I encourage people to, if it's a historical thing, to look at the social scientists as well, to look at sociologists and anthropologists. Some of whom, you don't necessarily have to start with the whole book, but the journal articles to sort of dive into that and think about how are they framing this period of history? Like what's happening at this time period that is going to surface in this event that I'm writing about. So I definitely start there. And then as a writer, my thing is just fundamentally to like, when you're in the early stages, just write down everything. Like write down, keep your notes, keep your really meticulous notes. And if you're writing historical fiction, just whenever you're inspired by something, write that thing, because you never know if it'll come in handy later.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate the writers that bring us history and keep subjects alive, and that's what I love. And so, people, please go out and get this book. It's by Alice Markham-Cantor, and it's called "The Once and Future Witch Hunt: Descendants, Reckoning from Salem to the Present." So. And I'm sure they can go to your website, which is your name, alicemarkham-cantor.com, or Amazon, and pretty much anywhere else they can find books.
It's around.
It's around. Well, Alice, thank you so much. I hope you come back. And are there any new books coming out that you have your fingers writing and typing and all that stuff?
I got some ideas.
Okay.
But they're very, very, very early stage. So, I'm gonna keep that secret for now, but I hope to come back and chat with you about it later.
I would love it. So please support Alice and her endeavors of writing these amazing historical books. So thank you, Alice. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tony.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining Truth Be Told every Friday here at 3:00 Pacific time. Again, without you guys, celebrating our history and mystery of the paranormal world, and just the histories of some of the controversial subjects that we talk about from all over the world. But I appreciate you for tuning in every Friday. And until next time, again, Take care of yourself and each other, and I'll see you soon. Take care.